This is Dr. John, and we are beginning the second quarter of our lectures in biology. And this week we're talking about the chemistry of life. I'm really excited about this second quarter, and I'm actually quite happy about the performance of you students in the first quarter. And I'm looking forward to you doing equally well in the second quarter. As we begin to talk about the chemistry of life, we start out with the basic building blocks of matter. And those basic building blocks are called atoms. The term atom is actually something that came from the Greeks, and it means to be indivisible. And it was a speculative idea in the Greeks that all of matter was composed of these indivisible pieces called atoms. Now, I've used the term matter several times, and I should define what I'm talking about. And matter actually is not an easy term to discuss, but it's anything that has mass and takes up space. Now, some people confuse the term matter or mass with weight. But weight also takes into account the idea of gravity, because as you know, your weight is different depending on where you are in the universe. Mass or matter is that stuff that everything is made up of. Now, what you're looking at in this picture is something called a model. A model is an explanation or a representation of something that cannot be seen. Obviously, we cannot take pictures of atoms. They're a little bit too small. And so what we do in those situations is we make up in our mind a little cartoon representation that takes into account all the data that we have, and we use that to explain what an atom is, or what a molecule is, or whatever something you can't see is. What you notice here in this picture actually is you have three pieces of real data, okay? This is light spectroscopy data showing that the electrons of an atom take up three energy spaces. Here's the first energy space, here's the second energy space, and here's the third energy space. And so as a result of this scientific data, scientists have drawn this picture. Here's the first orbit of that first electron's energy space. Here's the next orbit of the next electron's energy space, and then the next orbit of the third electron's energy space. And so each of these represents an energy space. All of these are things that we cannot see. And this is a drawing to represent something we cannot see. So this is what is meant by a model. Now, models come in all forms, but atoms are made up of three pieces. And here we have the names of the three pieces of the atoms involved. The positively charged particles in the nucleus of an atom. The nucleus of an atom is the part of the atom on the inside. In the planetary model, which is shown here on the right, here's Saturn with its rings. The nucleus represents the planet, and the outside, the rings of the planet or orbits of the moon of the planet, represent the electrons, which are the negatively charged particles in the atom. So in this planetary model, sorry about that. In this planetary model, the positively charged particles are in the nucleus, and the nucleus is in the middle. The negatively charged particles, called electrons, are on the outside. And also within the center or nucleus are neutral or non-charged particles known as neutrons. Now this other model over here is called the plum pudding model. This is a piece of plum pudding, and you have the outside stuff, and then you have the pieces of plum stuck in the midst of it. And when they drew this model of the atom, it was believed that the brown material represented the positively charged particles or matter, and the little pieces of plum represented the electrons or the negatively charged. But as more data was received, it was felt that this did not accurately depict what an atom was really like, and they moved over to this planetary model. Now, atoms make up something called elements. An element is a collection of atoms. All of the atoms in an element have the same number of protons. All the atoms in an element have the same properties. And so, although these two diagrams are not pictures of an element, each of the pieces, here we have copper, that is an element. Here we have chlorine, that is an element. And so an element is a group of atoms clustered together or grouped together, and they have the same number of protons, and because they have the same number of protons, they have the same chemical and physical properties. Now, when you take two or more atoms and link them together, then you've made what is known as a molecule. So a molecule is a particle or a substance that results from the linking up of different atoms to each other. And as it turns out, many times the properties of the combination are totally different than the properties of each atom that makes up the molecule. For example, let's take the example on this paper. This is copper chloride. Okay, here's what it looks like over here. It's a powder, kind of a brownish powdery substance. Now it's made up of copper atoms, and you guys know that copper is a metal. It has kind of a brownish tinge to it. It conducts electricity, but it doesn't look anything like this powder over here. And chlorine is the other atom that makes up copper chloride, and chlorine is a gas, a greenish gas. But when you put these two together, you end up with something very different. And this is what's known as a molecule. And a molecule can be represented on paper by a shorthand representation called a chemical formula. And when we talk about this, we'll talk about this in basic science for those of you that hadn't had basic science yet. We will also talk about it in chemistry in much more detail for those of you that are headed for chemistry next. Now, we've talked about matter, and we've talked about various parts of matter and how matter is put together. But now let's talk about changes in matter. Now there's two fundamental ways in which matter can change. One is called a physical change. A physical change is a change that affects the appearance of a substance, but generally does not affect its chemical properties or how it acts. And this picture right over here is an example of a physical change. If you look at it closely, you'll recognize that this is rust. Okay, or corrosion. Now actually it's not a very good example of a physical change, because rust represents the oxidation, or is actually truly a chemical change. Now if we were to melt this piece of metal here, or this piece of metal over here, this is supposed to be an example of something that doesn't rust, then you could see very clearly that melting, that change from a solid to a liquid, that's a physical change. But rust actually represents a chemical change, which is what we have here. A chemical change is a change that alters the makeup of the elements and molecules of the substance, and it changes the properties. And what rust does is it takes, let's say that this is the original metal here was iron, And what rust represents is a combination of the iron with oxygen to make iron oxide. And iron oxide is what we colloquially call rust. Now what they've done over here is they've coated the iron or steel parts of this with something called chrome, and they've coated it with chrome because it resists that chemical change known as rust. Now, in addition to physical and chemical changes, you can take the physical changes and actually change that or subdivide that into something known as changes of phase or changes of state. And this diagram represents the three fundamental phases of a substance. There are actually 5, but there are only 3 that we generally talk about. A phase is one of 3 forms that every substance is capable of attaining. One of those forms is known as the solid phase, which is over here. A solid phase is fixed in 3 dimensions. The atoms move less, and what you notice is it has a fixed shape and a fixed volume. Now it's not entirely fixed. If you put enough force on this cube, you can make it smaller than it currently is, but it takes a huge amount of force in order to do that. The atoms in this solid are fixed in place in what's known as a lattice, and that's what gives the solid its fixed shape and volume. The second form is here in the middle. It's called a liquid. Now a liquid has a fixed volume but not a fixed shape. It takes the shape of the container that it fills, and it forms a surface. So it's a phase that's fixed in one direction or one dimension. It keeps its volume constant. The atoms move more within the structure than in the solid phase, but less than in a gas, which is shown on the right. A gas expands to fill whatever container it's in. It is not fixed in any dimension. There are force interactions between the molecules, but they're extremely weak, and that they're not strong enough to allow for it to be fixed in any particular shape or form. When we return to the next part, we will continue talking about these various aspects of chemistry.